Welcome to the KC Ingram Show, Meet Your Candidate series. No spin, no agenda, no endorsements, just the candidate. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the many listeners who submitted questions for this interview. Several of those questions have been incorporated into today's discussion. Questions are not shared with the candidates prior to the interview. If you enjoy the show and would like to stay informed on local issues and elections, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'm KC Ingram. Let's get into it. James Martin is a Democratic candidate for U.S. Congress in Florida's Congressional District 21, currently held by Brian Mass. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks so much, Casey. Longtime listener, first time caller. Excited to be here.
Oh, I remember that bit. I'm excited to have you. So, for viewers meeting you for the first time, James, tell us about yourself and what experiences have shaped you and what inspired you to run for Congress.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, fourth generation Martin County local. I was born and raised here in Hope Sound, where I'm sitting right now. My mom was a public school teacher for 31 years here in Martin County schools. And my dad's a small businessman. He actually still runs the small business my great grandfather started in the 30s here in Hope Sound, Diamond Transfer and Garage. And after graduating from Martin County Public Schools, I joined the Coast Guard. I went to the Coast Guard Academy, became an officer in the Coast Guard, and crisscrossed the Middle East, the Caribbean. Even actually spent 2 years here in South Florida up in Fort Pierce. I was the captain of two ships out of there. And then I actually served at the White House the last 3.5, almost 4 years. I was on active duty working on national security policy. So, not the first time I'm working to work on applying for a job to work on policy. And fundamentally, I wanted to run for Congress because my time in the Coast Guard was coming to an end, and I was looking around, and I strongly felt that if we didn't make a change, that the opportunities that I had growing up, I lived the American dream, got to go to the Federal Service Academy, join the Coast Guard, see the world, all of that, worked for two presidents, two vice presidents. If we didn't make a change, the opportunities that I had growing up were not going to be the same ones that my two little girls had. And that's the case for tens of thousands of children across the Treasure Coast. So that's why I felt strongly because, when I looked to DC, and that's sort of where my formative policy experience is and where I feel I can make the most impact. When I look to DC and I see my representative who I feel is taking his eye off the ball and not concerned with the issues, and there's real issues that a lot of folks are facing here on the Treasure Coast and Northern Palm Beaches, whether we're talking about cost of living crisis, clean water, you name it. People are really going through it. And when I see my representative more concerned with playing DC parlor games and climbing the DC ladder, that's I have a real problem with that. And my strong view is if you can do something about it, you should. So that's why I stepped up and why I'm on this journey.
All right, very good. And you answered two questions there in one. I was going to ask you why now and why, choosing at this time with Congressman Maston Congress. You just went through all that, so I appreciate it. And by the way, you're coming 100 years on a family-owned business. That's absolutely incredible and hard to come by these days. So just congratulations on that.
Thanks so much. All credit
Your whole
to,
family.
my dad. Yeah. But, as most people will know in a family business, in a small business, even though you're not on the payroll, there's plenty of holidays where or you get a call, hey, I need you to help me move something. So it's a family affair. No,
That's
no doubt
right.
about it.
You got it. So every congressional district has unique needs. What do you see as the three biggest challenges facing Florida's 21st congressional district?
Sure. Well, I think we mentioned two of them. I think in the first instance, the cost of living crisis, I don't know that that's particularly unique to our district, but here I think in the 21st it manifests itself a little differently maybe than other parts of the country. I think a big way that the cost of living crisis manifests itself here, I'm a big proponent of repealing tariffs and some different policy ideas around healthcare. But I think the big one here in Florida that we need to talk about is the property insurance crisis. And my strong view is and here's the reason why, because people at the national level, they want to talk about, we need to build more housing, all sorts of interesting policy ideas about housing. In Florida, we well know that there's plenty of housing stock. It's the fact that property insurance prevents young people from getting into houses. It pushes the elderly out of their homes, and it squeezes the budgets of everyone else in between. If you're a teacher, a new teacher in the state of Florida, I've heard some reports that people's property insurance has gone up to, some $9,000 or $10,000 a year. That in many cases, that's almost a quarter of your take home pay as a teacher. That's crazy. So what I would propose to counteract that is if the state legislature, which has had several opportunities to do this, if they can't backstop citizens insurance and sort of come to uh, an end to this crisis or introduce policy instruments to do so, we need to do something at the federal level. And there is legislation at the federal level, the Homeowners Defense Act, which was introduced in 22 or 23, but it's an existing bill that could be passed tomorrow if we wanted it to. Maybe not tomorrow, since we're in the weekend here, but and that exists, and that would provide a federal backstop to citizens insurance and provide some relief. So that's sort of one bucket on the cost of living crisis. The second one, and this is one that is no secret to many of the listeners of your show, is our clean water crisis. Right? It's been persistent really since the 1950s. As students of the sport, as I would say, well know, but it really become acute the past decade or so, the toxic algal blooms. And I'd be the first to say we've made progress on the issue, and I appreciate that. Particularly the incumbent has elevated the issue, but I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I intend to do that work in Congress. And I think the big differentiator maybe between the incumbent and myself on that issue is going to be one, I'm of the strong view that you shouldn't have to wonder whether how your member of Congress is going to vote on something based on whose name is at the top of the bill. I'm really critical of Brian Mast for voting against the largest appropriations for Everglades funding ever, $1.1 billion. It was in the Biden era infrastructure bill, and I can appreciate that someone might have an issue with that. But also, if you're going to go around calling yourself Mr. Everglades, I have a real problem with that. And then the second thing, which has become more into the fore during the second Trump administration, is the repeal and the curtailing and the attenuation of our bedrock environmental laws, things like the National Environmental Policy Act. And we're seeing some of this with, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of these data centers, right? And so we're seeing the repeal of some of these bedrock environmental laws, which, one man's red tape. There's a reason we created the EPA. Rivers were on fire, right, in the 1970s. And I'm not for the repeal or the attenuation of bedrock environmental laws. So I think if you're an environmentalist, you're an environmentalist, not convenient as the issues come down the pipe. So that's those are two, and then I think maybe the third for our district. I think it's a real it's a real hot button issue is immigration, right? Is so I'm the only person in this race. We see some of the Coast Guard paraphernalia in the background here. I'm the only person in this race who has conducted federal immigration enforcement on the high seas. Like I know firsthand the human face of immigration. I've seen people try and drink bleach, eat glass, like horrible things because they thought that they might get airlifted to the United States if they did that. So like, really grim stuff. And especially if there's a lot of folks here who have spent time on the high seas, huge coastal community here. People know that the ocean is, not to be trifled with. It's a very dangerous place. And when you see some of what, and I'll get into the point here, but when you see, just to underscore for folks, when you see what people are willing to risk to leave their home, because fundamentally no one wants to really leave their home, is a view I have, and to risk not only their lives but sometimes the lives of their children and their loved ones just to maybe get a chance at the United States. So that sort of underlines the stakes. I firmly believe that at the same time, we're a nation of laws. Like not everyone can just come here, and the asylum process is there for a reason, and people need to follow the rules. But at the same time, we can be, in my view, a moral nation, and so all to say, I'm of the firm view we need a safe, fair, transparent, and humane immigration system in this country. And I say that that's an issue for our communities because we do have a huge Hispanic population on the Treasure Coast, and so I think it's important to mention. So those are the three issues I think in particular: cost of living crisis, drilled down into property insurance, clean water crisis, and then I think immigration. But there you have it.
Very good. Thank you for that. Now, jumping back to home insurance, that really is a big issue here in Florida. Yeah, I always ask the state candidates about this, and so I'm not sure that the federal would even have any authority of this, to be honest with you. But, why can't we expand the footprint of the marketplace for the insurance companies? Maybe it's Southeast United States rather than by state.
Sure, and I am, I would be the first to say I'm not an expert on the insurance market, but I would, on its face, that seems like a reasonable proposal. I'm old enough to remember one of the last folks who ran for this seat. They proposed something similar. It was, sort of related to disaster relief, and it was a news interview, and he got laughed off the stage, and the host was a little bit rude to him about it. And then the next week, those hurricanes hit western North Carolina, and then all of a sudden, it doesn't seem such a crazy idea to pool those insurance by region. So I think on its face, it merits taking a pretty strong look at it.
So, if you're elected, what would be your first bill or legislative priority?
Sure. Well, this is such a terrific question, and I have a little bit of an unorthodox answer. First, I kind of have two answers. One, we need to do immediately what we can immediately do to address the cost of living crisis. I think the easy thing we can do is repeal reckless tariffs. The second, and I'll explain why this is important. We need to get big money out of politics. It's going to be a little bit complicated to do so, but we need to do it because any of the hot button issues, any of the big ideas we want to address, until we get big money out of politics and overturn Citizens United, we're not going to be able to do it. I'm sure you well know that in this election, AI companies, for example, are putting hundreds of millions of dollars behind candidates who back their policy preferences. So whether we're talking about breaking up food monopolies or AI or big sugar, you name it, we're not going to be able to make progress on it until people can't spend unlimited dollars without anyone knowing who's spending it in these elections. Because they're putting these up with these benign packs like Save America or Democracy for All pack, and but it's really the worst guys you've ever seen, and these cartoon villains who are putting the money behind it. So that's got to stop, in my view.
So, James, I love what you're saying. I'll be honest, but you're one of 435 people there, and it seems like when candidates become elected officials, they end up becoming entrenched into the system. And what are your thoughts on trying to break into that system? Because one person is not going to be able to change those laws. I agree with you; they certainly need reform. But again, it just seems like once people are entrenched there, it becomes kind of a back burner issue that never sees the light again.
Sure. Well, I think it's a very fair question. So I appreciate it because I think as you and I have both seen, I've lived in Martin County most of my life, and you see candidates come and go, campaign promises come and go, but one of the first big things that first big policy positions we took on my campaign was to have a strong stance on anti-corruption and not taking corporate PAC money, not and being for banning not only stock trading, and this is where sort of some of our policy proposal is a little bit different, a little bit stronger than maybe some, blanket. We should ban stock trading for members of Congress because I think everyone agrees on that. It also includes, crypto because you can hide a lot of things in cryptocurrency, but as well banning on the speculative market and maps it across not just the legislative branch, but the executive branch and the judicial branch. So that's the first step because I agree. It's real easy to talk a big game, but then all of a sudden, if every year come January 1, if your campaign account automatically gets $300,000 or $400,000 worth of $5,000 checks from all the big Fortune 500 companies, it's pretty tough to take a big stand against corruption, no doubt about it. But I think secondary to that, and to your point of I'm one of many, that's true. The two things I would say to that: one, I think that there's a real hunger in the country to make some of these changes to excise big money from our politics. So I am optimistic and hopeful that there are a lot of like-minded folks that are on both sides of the aisle, I would add, that want to see this get done because that's ultimately what the job I'm trying out for is to go to Washington to make people's lives better. I don't care who I have to work with to do that. I just want their lives to be better because I care about this place. And then the last thing I would say on you're one of many. The good news is if you and this one is maybe for maybe some the independents or Republicans watching who say and I've had people tell me this on the trail. Well, I really like what you had to say, but I don't want you to just go up there and just be rubber stamped for the team with the blue jerseys. And the good news is if you win this seat and hold this seat, there's a lot of independence that comes with that in the Democratic caucus, and so ultimately there's power in that, and That's what I'm going up there to do, is make people on the Treasure Coast in northern Palm Beach's lives better, not just put on a jersey and just say, show me where to sit," kind of thing.
Not as the interviewer, but as a potential constituent. I just hope and would ask you just stay true to those values because even our current congressman, when he was first elected, he said he believed in term limits. He signed an oath that he would serve. I think it was 2 terms. He started stock trading. So, I think the American people want those things. They want a ban on stock trading because it's unfair to the regular working guy. We don't have the same
Totally.
information, the term limits, that kind of thing. So hold the line. I think the American people support the members of Congress that get elected. They just got to hold the line. And when they get in there and get, all the benefits that come with it, stay true to those values. So just a side note there,
Of course.
personally, but which I don't normally add, but you're talking about some things that I've covered in my show previously. So, all right, James, Congress has historically a low approval ratings. How would you represent this district differently than the typical member of Congress?
Sure. I think it's such a great point. And so two things I would say. One, and this is a point I always make on the trail because sometimes people are like, they want red meat, they want to break out the pitchforks kind of thing. And I always tell them, look, we have a very thin margin to make people's lives better because what people are going to say if we, flip the house and everything else, people are going to say, see, you guys are just as bad. You're just wearing a different colored jersey. And that's not what we're setting out to do. So ultimately, deliver results and be results driven and make people's lives better. But two, more central to this district and to me, one of the things along with the anti corruption policy proposal is we've taken a very firm transparency addendum to that policy. And we've committed, as we talked about Brian Mast, and one of the big things a lot of folks, rightfully in my view, are critical of him about is some of the lack of town halls. He did sort of a road show, quick in one day last April. But we've committed to routinize town halls. We've committed to routinize, quarterly and then semi-annual roundtables with not only business leaders, not only civic leaders, but leaders in the community because that's really important, and elected officials, excuse me, because that's really important to obviously you maintain relationships with all those folks, but to be in a setting where people can talk about that is really important. And then the third thing is, and this is might blow your mind, to my view and to my knowledge, there's only one member of the Senate and Congress who has made their schedule public, and that's Senator Mark Kelly. And so one of my strong views is, public service is a public trust, and especially working at the White House, like all that stuff, had to be public. So I've committed to making my schedule public because I think it's important that people know who I'm meeting with, what I'm doing, what I'm up to. They voted to send me there. They ought to know what they're paying for. So that's sort of to both deliver results and then to be really transparent with the people who sent me there.
So, immigration remains one of the defining issues in the election. You spoke about it earlier. What
Mhm.
specific reforms would you support to secure the border while maintaining a fair legal immigration system?
Sure. So I think one of the big, the hot button issues that when we talk about immigration is people always want to know, are you abolish ICE or what's the deal? As someone who, because the Coast Guard is a federal law enforcement agency as well as a military service, so I am strongly of the view that we need immigration enforcement in this country. How it's being done right now, I have a strong disagreement with some of the more militarized immigration sweeps we see on American streets. So I am not in favor of that. What the big thing that I have a problem with those and with the current budget of ICE, which is bigger than the U.S. Marine Corps, like just to level set, and the U.S. I think the U.S. Marine Corps and the Coast Guard combined actually, is we talk about federal asylum and people talk about how parole is such an issue. One of the things that I would like to see is use some of those funds to properly fund both the asylum judge process so that we can follow what are instantiated and current US law that people, do have the right to have an asylum hearing and everything else, but such that it follows a timeline that's reasonable. And then you won't have people who are on parole for months and years at a time. It should be a very, when I say a safe, fair, and transparent, it should be that people should know if I come to apply for asylum in the United States, I'm going to get a hearing within, 2 to 3 weeks. And then that's the decision. And either I'm on a plane or a train or however I need to get back to my home country, or it really is the case that I legally could claim asylum in my country because, of a disaster or political situation or persecution. And then, we follow the next steps. So I think that's something that could be a lot better done. And what I would like to see done if I'm elected to Congress, and I'd be happy to work with anyone to make that happen.
Do you support additional funding for ICE?
At this stage, no, I don't. I would rather see the what has been additionally funded to ICE. I would rather see that repurposed for some of these asylum judges and to streamline the asylum process so that it can be, truly transparent and humane.
Should ICE focus primarily on the violent criminals and those with deportation orders, or should it continue the broader immigration enforcement?
Absolutely. I have no issue. So absolutely focus on violent criminals. And I think almost anyone would agree, and I would hope so, that they agree that we should not have violent criminals in this country, particularly violent criminals who aren't supposed to be here or have, gang ties. Where I do have concern is when that natural aversion to having those people in our country is politicized, and maybe some people are made to have those ties when they don't really. Because most reasonable people would say, of course, I don't want to, some horrible gang member with a rap sheet. But, when you drill down to it and it's, a hairdresser or whoever else, like, that's what I mean by some of those things have been politicized in my view.
Would you support any pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States? And if so, under what conditions?
I think that I would, and I think the conditions would have to be. I don't know that I have a specific set of criteria laid out in my head, but I think it would have to be appropriately stringent and not loosey goosey. But I do think that folks, particularly those who or I think like this is what I think of when I think of the folks you're talking about, people who have been here for years, who are pillars of their community, that sort of thing. I think it's completely reasonable that they should have a pathway to citizenship. And in part, some of the stories I hear, and this is not, so this is an anecdote, not a generalization. Some of the stories I hear, right, are of, I was trying to jump through the hoops. It was so expensive and all the stuff. And I'm not saying that makes it right or wrong, because there are plenty of people who did jump through all the hoops and spend the money, and they did it the right way. But again, to the transparency side of it is if you purposely make the system so difficult that people would just rather break the law and not follow the rules than, like basically be on the lam most of their rest of their lives than just follow the procedure. That to me begs the question: is that a system that's doing what it should?
The conflict involving Iran has heightened concerns about another U.S. military conflict in the Middle East. Under what circumstances should the United States use military force against Iran?
Sure. Well, I think I've been pretty vocally disagreed with the current conflict in Iran, and I would say the reason why, and goes to my litmus test for not just the conflict in Iran, but any conflict in which U.S. military force is being used, is it has to be in the U.S. national interest. And with respect to Iran, what the arguments that were presented were initially 2 to 3 different ones with no real strategic end state. And that's why we're seeing now, in my view, right, there are not really many good options for the Trump administration to extricate themselves from this conflict. And that stems from there not being a clearly identified and articulated strategic end state. We've heard several different versions of, it was regime change. We wanted to degrade the Navy, the military. We wanted to get the highly enriched uranium out. And look, I say all this, Casey, as someone who has had Iranian guns pointed at me like multiple times in my life. I, was the second command of Coast Guard cutter in the Middle East, had many interactions with IRGCN, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Navy, like their fast boats. So like I am not, a peacenik, like I love Iran kind of guy, but it has to be in the U.S. national interest. And that's why I have such an issue with it, is because particularly when we're going to put U.S. troops in harm's way, to me, the litmus test for that always has to be in the U.S. national interest, and I don't think that was met in this case.
Do you support continued military aid to Israel?
Well, I think on this issue, the thing to understand, I'll throw out a couple people, and you might be surprised at the spectrum of all these people who agree on what the second statement I'm about to say. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Lindsey Graham, AOC, President Trump, all of them are of the view that a country as wealthy and as rich as Israel should probably not get, a almost $4 billion military subsidy every year. So, and that is set to sunset. So if all those people agree and that is the direction of travel, that the real question becomes, the phrase skate to where the puck is going. Where the puck is going, the real question actually is now, should the US sell arms to Israel? And on that score, my view is the same as it would be for any other country, if we sell arms to this country, is that both in the interest of the United States? Does it follow U.S. law? And I think as a member of Congress, particularly when we're talking about U.S. taxpayer dollars, we need to be really firm stewards of that. And also, if we're going to sell, U.S. military weaponry, which is the best of the world, we need to ensure that it follows U.S. law. So that's how I feel both about Israel and any other country we're going to sell weapons to, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Japan, any of our allies.
So would you sell weapons to Israel?
In the current climate, I think I am for selling defensive weaponry. Israel does live in it's very easy to forget in the polarized environment that we do live in, that Israel does live in a very tough neighborhood, and a lot of its neighbors would like to see it wiped off the face of the earth. At the same time, in October 7th, completely horrible tragedy. And I think, many people forget how the United States would act if, say, a cartel in Mexico came across the Texas or California border and did something similar to us. Like, people do need to keep that in the back of their minds. At the same time, I think, it's completely the case that anyone who's a human who sees some of the searing images that come out of Gaza can say to themselves, this isn't right. I have a little bit of pause with what's going on here. So I am for continuing to sell defensive weaponry, David Sling, Iron Dome, that sort of thing. But I think when we talk about offensive weaponry, I think that is probably off the table for me when and until Israel can demonstrate themselves to be responsible actors, which I think in the past few months has, they do have a right to defend themselves, but how matters.
What about Ukraine? Do you support sending aid or continuing to send aid to Ukraine?
I do. And I appreciate why people in some cases get worked up about it, because, we should be very conscious stewards of the taxpayer dollars. But if you talk to supporting Ukraine and giving them the best seat at the negotiating table is strongly in the United States' strategic interest, because if Russia is allowed, if we operate under the idea that you can change borders by force, the world has just become an extremely dangerous place, which is not to the benefit of the United States. If we think we're currently in the world's most dangerous security environment in, 80 years, you haven't seen anything yet. So it's strongly in our strategic interest. It's also important to remember, and this is, one of the things I worked in my military assignment was partially in the Biden administration, but I think, calling balls and strikes. This is one of the things that they did a very poor job at articulating is people see the number on Ukraine aid and say, this is, unreasonable, this is crazy, all the things. But when you consider that a huge proportion of that aid, right, was essentially rotting Soviet stockpiles that were going to go bad anyway, that we assigned a dollar value to so that it looked good on paper, like, that's one part of it. Two, a lot of what we have sold them and given them since has bolstered the U.S. defense industrial base, which, both the Ukraine war and some other actions around the globe recently have really highlighted that our defense industrial base has atrophied and needs a kickstart. And there's a lot of really smart people who are, working around the clock on thinking about how that can be better. So that's sort of the second bucket of it. And then the third thing I would just say is, and again, this is not something that was well articulated and the case not well made to the public. And that's, I think, why some of these ideas are allowed to fester, is the idea that, really when you break it down, like Europe has really, I think until the last tranche of Ukraine aid, Europe had overwhelmingly given more aid to Ukraine. So just keeping in mind like the context, I think is important. But all to say, yes, proponent of supporting Ukraine and giving them the best seat at the negotiating table. It is in our strategic interest.
Now, China continues expanding economically and militarily. What should
Mhm.
Congress do to strengthen America's position?
Sure. Well, this is such a good question. I love talking about all the national security stuff, which I don't get to talk about often enough on the trail. This is one area where I think Mr. Mast and I would find agreement. I often joke and kind of make light of the only area he can criticize the president on is export controls, chip export controls, which is, of course, the high powered, most consequential and best NVIDIA chips, preventing selling those for China. So the export controls being that we cannot sell them to China, or there's limits on how they are sold to China. And he is in the right on that, and we should not sell those chips to China. So good for him for thinking so. But more broadly to your question, and this goes is maybe counter to some of the positions many Democrats would have, is like having worked at the highest levels of our government, and not just because I spent time in the military, but like understanding what underpins the US's position in the world is in large part both our economic heft and the fact that the dollar is the backbone of the world financial system, and two, the US military. So we absolutely need a strong U.S. military and a strong U.S. industrial base, and that's not a warlike thing to say. That is what enables people to have their lovely First Amendment rights on everything under the sun. So that's it's less of an opinion and just a fact in my view. So that's sort of one part of it. I think the second part is to the financial piece, and really when you talk about it's more economic than financial, if I can distinguish the two, because the financial is more like the world financial system and the economic would be like companies in sort of my view. And I think what the United States can do, and some of this is one area where I'll say I think the Biden administration did a good thing, is the Chips and Science Act bolstering the US both chip industry and some of these what we'd call critical manufacturing, both because they produce things that are useful for the defense industrial base, but just things that COVID highlighted. There's certain things that we need, and it would be really good if China didn't have the monopoly on them. Setting aside chips and that sort of thing. Medicine is a real big one. China controls a huge part of the pharmaceutical industry. India is sort of taking up the mantle, but it doesn't leave you don't need a creative imagination to see how that is maybe not a good thing for the United States. So those, for taking it back to Congress, what we can do at the federal level to stimulate some of that economic growth and economic competition from U.S. companies is whether that's federal grants to stimulate world leading companies like SpaceX, right? Like that was people a lot of times like to make hay that Obama gave Elon money, but like setting aside, like I think it's great that we have the foremost space company in the world and lead the world on that. That's a good thing for the United States of America. So investments like that, where we can continue to have the best companies in the world. And the last thing I'll say on this, because we're talking about the best companies in the world, is I think on immigration, where we need maybe like pursuant to the idea when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. I think we need a reframe of immigration. I think we really need to think of it as, recruiting. Like we need to think of it this way. The number one draft picks from every single country in the world want to come here and be on our team. That's a good thing. In my view, I don't think it necessarily should be at the expense of Americans. But if people want to come here and create the next SpaceX or the next Google or whatever, that's a good thing for America. And that's the secret sauce why people should worry about China, no doubt about it. But that's the secret sauce as to why we're always going to win. That's why we, won the Cold War, is because there's just something about American dynamism and ingenuity that attracts those mavericks, the best of the best, and that's why they want to come here. So anything we can do to facilitate that and promote that, that's a good thing.
Okay. So the federal debt now exceeds $40 trillion.
Hmm.
What difficult decision is Congress avoiding?
Yeah, I think with respect to I would say the big one is with respect to the defense budget. Having said we need a strong national defense, I think, it's obviously the largest outlay, and it's a little, I don't want to say preposterous, but it is concerning, the $1.5 trillion, price tag, right? I think there's a real conversation to be had both in the Defense Department, and then I think this sort of bleeds into another of my policy ideas that I talk about on the trail, which is a lot of people were not in favor of Doge and the Department of Government efficiency. And I can understand why, because there's a lot of slash and burn and a lot of slapdash decisions made by not experts. But I think fundamentally, a lot of people are mistrustful of government, and having worked at the highest levels of it, I can say, like, I get it. Some of the things you had to do to get reimbursed for travel, or get new pens in the office. It's like, it's silly. So what I would be in favor of is what I would call like Doge 2.0, but it would be more operated like, pick your favorite CEO that you think is the best CEO ever, and they're going to lead a blue ribbon commission that, top experts, McKinsey, whoever they decide are the best, like most efficient people, and Congress agrees, give them 6 months to a year and say, you're going to come back at the end of the agreed upon time, and you are going to tell us what can be cut from the federal government, what your recommendations are. If you do cut this, this is what's going to happen. So that, I think, is something that a lot of people could get behind. And then Congress and the executive branch can come together and make appropriate decisions rather than unilaterally slashing departments. So I think that is a meaningful step towards cutting that national debt. I think there's certainly another conversation to be had with respect to tax cuts and things of that nature, because by my count, the Trump administration has added somewhere between 4 and 5 trillion to that debt through the tax cuts. Which, growing up, I was told that's what you know little c conservatives like cared about, like things like the national debt. And I often joke, and a great line I've heard is, that's the national debt is just Latin for a tax on everyone under 40, because it's inflationary. And we joke, but it's not a good thing, particularly when servicing the debt is exceeding the addition to the debt. That's a real problem.
It is. Now, do you believe Congress spends too much taxes, or do they tax too much? So do they spend too much, tax too much, or both?
Well, I'm in favor. Well, the executive branch is what spends. The Congress, appropriates and says, here's what you can spend. I think that there's a reasonable conversation to be had about the U.S. budget. I also think, with respect to what Congress does spend, I do think, and I would love to get more clarity on some of, the extravagant expenditures we see. Sometimes members of Congress, or the offices, or what it takes to upkeep the office. I do think that there's a real interesting conversation to be had, and I suspect that the general public would not be happy if a real light was shined on what goes on there. So I think those are kind of the two areas where I would say, like, it is probably the case that Congress does spend too much, and I think there's a reasonable conversation to be had about what is appropriated every single year.
Would you support congressional term limits?
Yes, that's part of our anti-corruption policy.
Should members of Congress be prohibited from trading individual stocks?
Absolutely.
What's one issue where you believe Republicans and Democrats could realistically find common ground?
I think two. One, immigration. I think, and there was a bipartisan immigration bill on the floor in late 2024, and I wish that had passed. I think the other one that should be a bipartisan issue, more close to home, is the clean water, right? And I think many folks, I'd be the first to say I appreciate what Brian Mass has done on the water to elevate the issue, and his advocacy of it. Do I think we can do more and better? Yes. Is part of that going to take time? Yes. But are there some aspects of it where we disagree on the margins? Yes. But ultimately, I think we both want the same things there.
So, James, one of the largest topics right now that's current here on the Treasure Coast, Palm Beach County, Indiantown, St. Lucie County, data centers.
Hmm.
Do you believe that there should be a national moratorium on data centers? How do are you supportive of they're popping up all over across the country? Kind of what are your thoughts? Does there need to be a little bit more regulation tied to those right now? Should we have a moratorium till we have more regulation, or let the states handle it?
So I am a terrific question, because there's 5 proposed data center sites, like total, that really kind of 3 areas west of Fort Pierce, what in Indiantown, and then the Project Tango out west near the Arden neighborhood in West Palm, which just got voted down this week. Great news. So super hot button issue for our area. And I'm of the view before we do a sweeping moratorium, we at least need a pause. And because until we know more, both we need to know more on some of the data, the initial reports and data and research is very alarming and really should cause pause that anyone would want to build any of these things. So we do need more data, I think, in the long run. But not only that, but the reason I'm for a temporary pause is my concern is, we're being told mostly by AI companies, mind you, and big tech companies that we need these. And my concern is if these are built and, particularly our natural landscape, that's why so many people are drawn to our home, to paradise. And my concern is if there's a bubble in the AI industry and it turns out we don't need actually as many of these data centers as was suggested, I don't want 5 data centers out in the district, marring our natural landscape and, ruining the aquifer, the sound, myriad reasons, noise, light, heat pollution, all of the things that are awful that have emerged as suggested that these will cause. I don't want those for, not really many local jobs. So all to say, for at least a temporary pause until we can know more. And I think we're going to know a lot more in the next few years, both on the research side and whether, these companies are still pushing these in the long run.
Right. If we need so many. All right, James. So could you please answer yes, no, and you can give a brief explanation if you desire. Do you support a balanced budget amendment?
Yeah.
Expand domestic energy production?
Yes, although I will say it's important to remember the United States is not the largest net exporter of energy. Multinational corporations, which are housed in the United States, are the largest exporter of energy. So there is a balance between like what is actually US owned and what the companies own. But like in principle, yeah, sure. We domestic energy production, great.
Okay. How
Yeah.
about eliminate taxes on Social Security?
Yes.
Require proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections?
In principle, yes. If we're referring to the SAVE Act, they do have real concerns about what that does because I think it's particularly ham-fisted when it comes to military families and women and erecting barriers for those folks to vote. So I think it just needs to be done in a thoughtful way and in a way where it's relatively not that everyone should be handed a driver's license off the street, but it should be as long as it's straightforward for people to get and not burdensome for people to get federal identification, then sure, yeah, shouldn't be a problem.
So you're the guy that gets to decide this. So just for today's magic wand over this.
Okay,
What
yeah, yeah.
what is the solution, for somebody to show their ID at the voting booth? What ID should they show? What do you want to see happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, a lot of times partially when I hear that some of these like scenarios, I always like laugh to myself. I'm like, "Oh, this sounds like someone who's like never voted in person before." A little bit, but it's the case that, to get a Florida driver's license, like there's all manner of things that you need. So like that seems like a reasonable thing, whether it's your pay stubs and everything else and that meets the federal requirement. What the SAVE Act does, and this is why I mention it, is it goes farther, and and then there's issues where you have to show marriage certificates and everything else, which and particularly
Right.
like if you're a military spouse living overseas, like that's where I'm like having lived this, like this is where like I can see the Swiss cheese size holes in this. But like, king for a day kind of thing. Like, yeah, Florida driver's license, state ID, military ID, sure, great. Because that to me meets both like the spirit and the letter of the law of, like you're clearly a US citizen or allowed to vote in US elections.
So, if elected, what is one promise you're making today that voters can hold you accountable for over the next 2 years?
We're not taking a dime of corporate PAC money now, and we're not going to do it then. And we've talked about the reasons why that's important, but the big one I think is overall because voters shouldn't have to wonder why and how. And I also don't own individual stocks, and I won't do that. Obviously not going to trade them, whether or not a ban is passed. So both of those things are important because voters shouldn't have to wonder how a member of Congress is going to vote based on what's in their stock portfolio, who's giving them money, any of that stuff. So that's something I intend to remain true to.
Very good. Many voters feel disconnected from Washington. How will you stay accessible to the people of District 21 after Election Day?
Sure. Well, as we discussed, both our intention to continue to be transparent and hold, the quarterly town halls and meet with civic, business, community leaders, both elected and non, several times a year, but also as well as the public schedule, which, I feel strongly about, but also just, I am of this place and like, because I love my home, that's why I feel so compelled to do this and to do it for my kids and others like them. So like I guess the other thing I would say is, it's not my intention to, go DC and that's, a big criticism of mine too of Brian Mass is, he's gone DC and he's like too busy playing DC parlor games. And I think whether you move to DC or not, I don't think that's really the fundamental issue. It's if you start to become a creature of DC, as some people would say, then I think that's a problem. I think people need to both see you here more, but also feel like you're here more, and that's something that I strongly intend to do.
So, if you had just 30 seconds to speak directly to every voter watching today, what would you like them to know?
Well, what I want people to know when they log off and say, huh, James Martin, I want them to know that James Martin is running to be everyone's congressman, not the Democratic congressman from the Treasure Coast, not the Republican congressman from the Treasure Coast. He's running to be everyone's congressman because I love this place and I want it to continue to be an amazing place to live, work, and grow your family for the next, 100 years like it has been for my family. So if you like what you heard, head to jamesmartinforflorida.com. And this campaign's for everybody. We'd love to have you and look forward to seeing you on the trail if we haven't met yet.
And final question, what do you believe sets you apart from your Democratic opponent, and why are you the best person to carry your party's message into the general election?
Terrific question. I think two things. One, we touch on this is the policy experience in DC making federal policy. In my case, national security policy, but not only do I have I made policy and have a feel for how policy moves in Washington, both between the executive branch and the legislative branch, but also there's so much to do in these next 2 years. We have a really thin window to deliver for people. And it's my sense is the House will probably flip. I don't know if the Senate will. While the Trump administration's in power, it's going to be chaotic. You can't send people who have not been in the room, have done that stuff. This is not a time to be learning on the job. We're in wartime footing. A lot of people are depending on whoever is elected to deliver results because this election's life and death for some people. When we're talking about whether it's insurance, whether it's tariffs, some of this stuff. So we need to take it really seriously. It's it's not a game. It's not a joke. It's not for social media clicks. It's a serious business, and government's serious business for serious people. So that's what I would say. I would also say too, I mentioned this is a campaign for everybody, and I'm not running to be the Democratic congressman or the Republican congressman, everyone's congressman. I think that empirically, like mathematically, and like looking at the studies, we know that people of my background, national security professionals, are able, and also longtime outdoorsmen, lifelong outdoorsmen, fishermen, everything else. I have the right background to appeal not only across the aisle, but to a large swath of our electorate that are independents. And I don't mean that in like a scientific way, like I can appeal to them. It's just, that's just a fact. And I can go places, a typical Democrat can't, whether that's VFW Hall, whether that's, down in the docks in Salerno or wherever. I'm very comfortable in those places, and that's what it's going to take to win in a district like this. No doubt about it. It's a little uphill. So that's why people should consider me, is because I've done it before and we're built to win. So head to jamesmartinforflorida.com. And Casey, this has been really, really lovely. Thanks for the time.
James Martin, it has absolutely been my privilege and pleasure. And folks, August 18th is primary day. Make sure you get out there and vote and choose your favorite candidate. And then one of the candidates here in the Democratic primary will move on to the general election. So they need your support right now, August 18th. Let's not have a low voter turnout. We can all do it. So James Martin, been a pleasure. You said that website was jamesmartinforflorida.com, and you can get some more information or support James's campaign. And finally, don't forget to follow the KC Ingram Show on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube for more real talk you will not hear anywhere else. I'm KC Ingram. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks again, James Martin.